Hi, everyone. My name is David Brennan, and welcome to the third installment of the Design Processes Workshop. This is hosted by Viking Motorsports, and today I'll be speaking about and discussing effective techniques for public speaking and presentations. So without further ado, uh, we can go into the overview. And essentially, before we can get underway, I'd like to mention that this workshop will include two exercises. Here's a brief overview as to what will be discussed throughout the presentation this afternoon. First, we'll revisit the prompt from design workshop or the design overview workshop. Then we'll recap the design basics workshop before we dive into the main topics. And at the end of the workshop, if time allows, we'll have a brief critique exercise. So without further delay, let's move forward. So I asked in the first workshop to reflect on design. And if you've been able to keep up, today we're going to revisit that prompt and essentially what the exercise entails. And we have to be honest. And so uh, it's an assessment of design for before and after the previous two workshops. And in that exercise, I instructed the following, which was to grab a writing instrument and a paper or tablet. We're going to have a before and after, and we're going to then follow these three prompts and answer them to the best of your perception and knowledge. And Google won't have the answer for you. And the first prompt was to you, what have been some notable examples of design? This could have been a car, building, boat, computer, or component, or a process. The second question was, in your personal opinion, what is the single most difficult aspect of design? And this could have been the function of or the form of the end use of the product. It could also have been problem mapping or how to strategize about tackling a design problem. And so the third prompt or the third question was name one strategy that you have used to overcome a dilemma in school, work, hobbies, or anything. Uh, and Yanni, since you're here, were you able to do this prompt?
Hey, sorry, I'm kind of like tuning in and out. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm probably just gonna leave my mic off for the time being.
Okay. Nope, not a problem. Yeah, so in that exercise, I went ahead and answered it, and I wanted to share my answer. Uh, Essentially, what I thought of was design was the Rimac Concept 1. It is a Croatian car manufacturer and automaker that specializes in electric vehicle high performance or hypercars. And they had their first release, which was the Concept 1, and they're currently in the process of their Concept 2, which is pending to release by the end of this year, beginning of next year. Uh, and I chose that as my before because I thought, it had a really nice appeal. It was sustainable. It also had the kind of luster that is a luxury performance and hypercar, all in one. And I think I'm just really, electrified, pun intended, by electric vehicles kind of consuming the mass transportation market now. Uh, but now, when I think of what the a notable design would be, is the unibody of MacBook Pro laptops and the iMacs. So they utilize a single sheet of extruded aluminum, and to which they cut out from the unibody of a MacBook Pro the shapes for the keyboard, the speakers, and for the housing and mounting of electronics, all in one piece of aluminum. And another thing that impressed me was for Apple, they had designed a iMac that actually has enough space within the cutouts of the frame of the unibody to actually develop or generate two keyboards or wireless keyboards for Apple. So they kind of leveraged and utilized all the material in a single step so that they could then, be fruitful or frugal rather. Uh, so when I wanted to discuss what is the second prompt, and this was to in your opinion, what is the most difficult aspect of design? For me, the most difficult aspect was the balancing of boundaries of radical and innovative with conservative fundamentals. I have the tendency to kind of go about and extrapolate or populate a bunch of ideas that I know which may not work, but it's fun to explore, or without a scope of our boundaries. Uh, but I kind of didn't think about the underlying principles of like how do we manufacture something, how do we even afford it, does it even exist? And so now my perception of the most single aspect of design is now finding and describing the relationships between systems of a dynamic system, a static system, etc., and how they all kind of correlate. And so that's been a recent topic of my interest in understanding how to go about solving difficult problems or the aspect of design with systems. And so the third prompt or question was to talk about a kind of method to overcome a dilemma, whether it was schoolwork or hobbies. And then before, I used to think of drawing solutions, being really visual, which I still do to this day. And now I kind of go through a block diagram and structures of how things interact and connect, and if there's a conversion process for me to visualize and better communicate ideas instead of just drawing them, because that also takes up much more time than, say, a block diagram or a problem structure, because I don't have to think about the details all in one go. In a conceptual model, I can instead lay it out as just a function as to what takes an input to an output, etc. And if there's a loop. And so that's now my kind of tools to overcome a design dilemma. So I can now move into, that was the end of our exercise. And so I wanted to briefly recap material from workshop 2 and to concise the multitude of content I presented, because it was a bunch. And some things to keep in mind is that there exists the triple constraint. That triple constraint will always be time, cost, priority. Essentially, if you choose 2, the third one will more than likely exceed expectation or fall beneath it and be overestimated or exceed initial estimations. Number 2, refinements are integral and critical to the process of designing, and is for designers, it helps to enhance the design acuity. Number 3, criticism is always present. Whenever you put yourself out there, similar to social media, an extension of you is made public and vulnerable. Someone will always have something to say. It is within a designer's demeanor to accept all criticism and act accordingly, but to never lose composure. Do not lose sight from less than desirable feedback. It is supposed to be empowering. Number 4, simply rendered by Benjamin Franklin, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. It is apparent now more than ever that diligent planning and the contingencies that may or may not arise are considered for each step. This is especially prevalent in downstream outcomes. Number 5, allowing yourself and team members to brainstorm and explore ideations is a powerful tool to exhaust all possibilities. On the contrary, if a team member or yourself doesn't keep a team member grounded or focused on the problem being solved, tangents or radical innovations will resolve in planning, which is very dangerous. Time is a priority. Number 6, however, the probability of accomplishing a possibility is normally the underlying mechanism that determines scope. Opportunity costs and compromises must be accepted in order for a project plan to be executed. Number 7, scope and scale are symbiotic. They coexist that define the undertaking or magnitude and direction of a product. And number 8, although I have introduced various models and methodologies, never strictly follow one or them in general. They are meant to serve as a basis for planning a project and comparing the progress relative to the chosen model or hybrid methodology or model that you have chosen. And we're utilizing the tools that designers have used, and we must reinforce the idea that to diverge and the immediate or to explore vague opportunities or threats is consequential to find the best solution for your problem. And so that first step in the design process, it was or tools rather, that we have, is to charter a project. A designer must understand the topic, product, need, or void that is to be solved. We must then designate through a series of actions to execute a plan according to the dilemmas we uncover. These dilemmas are often uncovered at the initial undertaking of the project, but there may be unforeseen hurdles throughout the life of a project. Examples of dilemmas could be subsystem breakdown, role responsibilities, scope, objectives, and or choice of design methodology. Again, project charter, which contains the steps essentially to identify, define, and synthesize, is a statement of the scope, objective, and participants in a project. And you have the tools that are present on the screen to utilize to charter a project. And then when it gets to the process of iterating said product or goal or need to solve, you use a analysis and optimization or evaluation or refinement. And this can take rather a series of weeks, sometimes months if there's hindrances, and to then kind of present or propose, this is what we do to encompass everything that we've worked towards, to say that our idea may be the best idea, and now we're ready to accept feedback, and then this puts us back into the loop of project iteration to optimize, refine, and move forward until we go to a manufacturing of a prototype. And so just to hammer it in for the first step, as we understood that the humans are functioning on a level of processing, and for that to happen, a project chartering identification is primary tool used to delineate a customer's need or prescribe the project motivation into a sequence of actionable steps. Research is fundamental for human processing in terms of understanding the void to be fulfilled. It is here that a designer is allowed the time to best understand the magnitude and precedence of the project they are to undertake. And so for design thinking methodology, we're still kind of hanging around on the first triangle, understanding what it is, visualizing, mapping, using a problem structure, drawing out through a morphological chart, and kind of getting these ideas on a paper. And so this is what it would look like if we're using a design methodology or design thinking approach. And so for the next would be in the double diamond model, is that we're still in the first half of the first diamond, and we're researching the problem statement to understand the users or understand the ecological feed or prosperity that is to come from the need of the customer, so that we can develop the form user insights to go about manufacturing the end goal. And it's typically really essential to brainstorm during this time, and ideation should be encouraged. Project objective motivation is typically then defined, and scope and scale is then initially or estimated or projected. And then we come about to the 7 kind of actions that happens between the designer or for the designer to react in a loop between the goal and the world that he has to try to deliver and receive criticism for. And then meshing that with the 7 principles of design, which is an action cycle to commence for the designer to move from abstraction into degrees of perception and understanding. And so you kind of start to ask yourself these questions coming from the world. You would then ask yourself, what happened? What does it mean? Is this okay? Which is your feedback. And then as a designer, your goal, what I want to accomplish, you have to understand what are the alternatives, what can I do, and how do I do it? And why do I do it also, which is what you feed into the world. And this is where you have a typical product released or service or good. And so it's really important here to understand the levels of processing that the designer must make that also coincides with any human's processing levels. I also introduced the idea between scale and scope and the analogy of it. To hammer it in, right? A scale is the growing or lessening of a project's time, its cost, and its priority, and its kind of evolution within that. And then for scope, you can either look at it as a classical Newtonian quantum or hyper problem, where it involves a step or an understanding between the levels. And you can also think of it as on a broader scope in an ME analogy between materials, components, processes, or assemblies. And so we introduced the Matryoshka dolls, and that is to show that the nesting of scale and scope are intertwined, and because of that, they allow us to develop competent planning of objectives, tasks, and dependencies. And so I introduced this kind of thinking and visualization to where the scale is essentially the boundaries for which we defined. And it also kind of encompasses the scope of what we're looking at. So we have the scale that obviously points to the boundaries of the circles. And we have the scope pointing into the area contained within that circle. If we imagine that line from left to right, or the major arrow is time, we can then think about how they must both coincide in order to work well. And if anything is an afterthought in design, it will present itself. And so coherence requires mutual inclusivity. With that said, I also said that these shapes here aren't, I guess, permanent. You can have hexagons, triangles, pentagons, even rather. And it's essentially you defining a system or a mapping of what helps you to understand a problem better so that you can solve it at a more efficient rate. One thing I would like to point out is that this large middle circle, where did my projector go? Oh, there it is. Cool. And so we have this circle, which is the third step or the third phase within a scale over project. And this circle here is the actual entire project scope that we want to live within. And so you see here that this area here of a scope or a scale for this phase is actually out of scope for the entire project. Therefore, anything in this phase or step of the design process, you should not even undertake, or it should be discarded, or it should be concised to where this kind of shape or this area here is not considered for your estimations of project timelines, the magnitude, and what you want to take on as a project manager. So to kind of hammer that in, here's another analogy where we used time again across the x-axis here. And we denoted that cost rises up here. You will always have a budget that cost will always be positive in this sense, but it's actually negative because you have less of it over time. And you also have priority precedence, which kind of tells you which one will take up. Priority delineates what will take up the most time, so it helps you to find a correlation between time and accomplishing this task and whether or not it should be done. And you can see here that sometimes there are transition phases that exist within this project. And you can see here this step or this phase will take up a high cost and will also be a high priority, whereas this phase will have a low cost and a low priority, but will take up the majority of the time because here is something that requires more evaluation or optimization. So it's very heated as to how a designer goes about maneuvering their project. but there isn't a linear path in doing so, or a linear method or mapping in making a project coherent between yourself and your team members. As a designer or project manager, you should always look forward into making sure that communication is vital between you and your team members. And so I want to introduce the next step, which is defining the problem. And so on the left-hand side, you have a problem structure that I introduced last time. And basically this was to say our main problem was a housing design, and really can work from a top-down or a bottom-up process. So from the right, if you worked from a top-down, it results in a series string of how. So we have a need, which is the machine must be safe. So how do we make a machine safe? And that's a question you ask yourself. Well, it should have a low risk of injury to operator, a low risk of operator mistakes, a low risk of damage to workpiece or tool. And so you can extend these for as much as possible. And so you're actually now then finding the problems and how they come about from making something safe. And then if you were to work from a bottom up, defined from a series string of why or what, and say that and you have to kind of phrase it in the sense was automatic cutout on overload will lead to a low risk of damage to a workpiece or a tool, and it will contribute to a machine being safe. Why must the machine be safe? Because it has to have a low risk of operator mistakes. Why must the machine be safe? Must have a low risk of injury to operator. So framing is very important, and the way you go about in direction of a problem to tackle the either it being ill-defined or very vague or openly defined or very narrowly defined. And so understanding what's available in resources and mapping out what you can access or utilize to your advantage to make a project successful, defining it is very key in terms later on that will be really relevant within the design process, such as the synthesizing of that problem into a visual format or into a representation that shows what we've delineated or estimated from the project in terms of scale and scope, how much time we think it's going to take, the priority it's been given, who it's been delegated to, what are deadlines we've established. And so all these time-bound values, we either use the SWOT or SMART analysis, and then we went about going into a DMM to generate and evaluate alternatives. And so this is synthesizing where we kind of conglomerate all that and have an estimation or initial Gantt chart here that will be developed over time as a project evolves. And so during that process of iterating within those phases in the Gantt chart or within those weeks or time-bound problems that you set for yourself, you have to always go back to the overall problem to ensure that the objections or functions, constraints, and requirements are confined to the solution that you're generating so that you don't run into problems where you forget that there's a structural requirement, if you forget there's a technical inspection requirement, if there's some sort of assuring test that you didn't perform on a bolt. And so these kind of things are present in FSAE, which will also be really helpful in terms of you becoming a better engineer, because you're now having the mindset of how do I go about understanding the failure modes so that I can analyze the effects of it and turn to mitigate, accept it, or deny it ever happen or avoid it from happening. And so when we go to generate or evaluate those alternatives and try to improve an iteration process to move forward, we use a DMM to evaluate those alternatives to quantify and qualify these overall parts, components, product objectives in the sense that we can add a number and a scale and give it a qualitative statement and say this is very good or very bad, which would then result in saying which of our options should we move forward with in producing for a prototype. This is how we go about doing so. And so I touched on this and I went through an example in workshop 2, which is toward the end of the video. So if you have more questions or would like to learn more, I encourage you to watch workshop 2. And it's pretty straightforward from there. Again, it gets very much more complicated than this. This is just a very vague, or not vague, but very exploratory and beginner kind of analyses. And so we can now move forward into the communication aspect of the presentation today. Again, we'll be going over what modes are, what are the elements, how you effectively communicate, what it means to be a competent communicator, and as well as some presentation and design cues, while we will then go over two presentations and analyze and give a criticism as to how the differences, the likes and dislikes of them, and how we can go about practicing delivering that critique, so that when we have general meetings and whatnot, or other design reviews, participants are able to give a constructive feedback to enhance the design and the project. Because that the objective of all this, especially for engineering, which I will say that 70% of your job requires you to be an effective communicator. And so the objective here today is to become a more effective communicator and understand methods of delivering information for specific purposes. And our first step is, or first thing to understand is, why is it important? It's inescapable. It's a human phenomenon, social phenomenon, and it consumes nearly 80 to 90% of our time, whether we know it or not. Communication is irreversible, and it's very complicated, especially when you talk about semantics between different cultures, when you talk about syntax, especially for languages in terms of between computer, human, binary. There's a broad scope, and it's especially for computer science majors, props to them. Some modes of communication is to dictate an action, to declare or direct someone to do something. Another mode is interaction, which is to reciprocate messages between the involved participants. And there has to then be a transaction, which is to exchange information. So if these three modes may all be present at once, or one without the other, or just a combination of two, it's when there's a mode mixture that can then distract people. And so if you say there's an interaction with an action, it could lead to confusion. And so when making a statement or using a specific mode, it's best to stick to a single mode of communication. Therefore, it leads to less confusion, and that could be done just by breaking up sentences and making sure the subject predicate agreements are satisfied. And so that brings me to the elements of communication. So within the previous slide, we talked about the modes. And so the participants, which is typically a human, there's gonna be a sender and receiver. Messages themselves can be meanings, symbols, which we have to then encode and decode. And then those messages can have a form, they can have a tone, they can also have varying contexts, and which is the environment. And so there's physical, there's social, historical, psychological, and cultural context that must always be adhered, because the last thing you want to do is insult someone who's speaking to someone who has a different cultural background, a different social background, historical and psychological background. Just goes to enhance the effectiveness of the messages being exchanged. And so it's always a duty between speakers, or when you're in a professional setting, to have etiquette to ensure that you're speaking without offending, or being very conscious of what you're saying. And so why does that not happen? Yeah, so through those elements of communication, we have channels, which is the pathway of the message. So which is a face-to-face, or what we now have, which is online. There's noise in communication. And again, this is the fluctuations, interpretations, and perceptions between the physical, the psychological, and semantics. and feedback, which is response to the message. And feedback can result in a verbal and nonverbal method. Nonverbal would essentially mean body language, and verbal is pretty self-explanatory. And so the communication process itself is that you have a source, a receiver, you have an encoding, which is the message you're trying to dictate over to the receiver, who has to decode your message. And then there is a feedback as to the message that the receiver then has to then source, encode, and deliver back. And so this loop can also get mixed up when there's interference involved a lot. And so you want to do your best to effectively communicate. And so to do that, we follow these principles of communication. Right? We understand that it has to meet a social need. It has purpose. We have to maintain relationships, and we have to exchange information. And that is so important, especially in a workplace, because things become misconstrued very, very easily. For a company that has like 10,000 employees, there has to be a hierarchical, logical system that allows different departments and parties to exist and coexist without a hiccup. And so to make sure that information exchange is very important. It has a purpose to develop and maintain our sense of self. It has to meet our social needs, develop and maintain relationships. Yep. And it's continuous. And so it's relational as well, and it's learned. You have to have someone teach you this language in order for you to use it. It will always be done because communication is 80 to 90% of our time. And relational because it varies in conscious thoughts. There is spontaneous expression, that is scripted and constructed messages to which we find a personal relation or a business relation, professional relation, family relation, and that relationship has to then be obviously transitioned through the different environments, the conscious thoughts and expressions, because those are guided by the cultural and ethical implications that follow. One example is the presidential debate. There's political implications there, which as a speaker, you want to definitely stay away from as a tidbit. There is a difference in generations and a difference in background between the two candidates. And so it's very interesting to see the principles and how they go about, constructing messages. And it's also shows you that the lack of etiquette that now exists in public speaking, especially in the presidential debate. But those are my 2 cents. And moving forward, there is a time value associated with communication, right? Words are constantly being evolved, developed, and accepted. There is a language order and spelling difference between cultures. And for example, between cultures, linguistics have told us that languages are a reflection of the innate human behavior to traverse and explore and conquer, ultimately. Understanding semantics of various cultures provides invaluable insights that can greatly impact the reception of a presentation. Over time, languages, words, etymology, and meaning can change or gain diverse implications. And so you can see these 3 sentences here. What do these 3 sentences have in common? They all ask a specific person or a receiver if they have their vase. But now think, what are the connotations that you associate for each sentence? Well, it's obvious. The first sentence appears to have an ancient spelling and ordering of words, but possession is difficult to discern. The second sentence is declarative, and it also uses modern spelling. And third, just to emphasize the point, is a ridiculous kind of abbreviation because meaning is completely lost. Over time, humans tend to move towards the concising the volume of speech. such as abbreviations and acronyms, which could be attributed to, well, hypothetically speaking, generational shifts, culture evolution, or external influence, such as technology. And so time value of communication is very important because over time, a lot of things help languages and cultures and semantics kind of move forward, move backwards, or evolve. And so to emphasize the time value point, it's you can always find a difference when speaking between, say, your parents or between your peers, which is one way to kind of think about it as well. A competent communicator utilizes a assertion evidence delivery. Essentially what that is, and I'll post a link of this in the channel, is a delivery aspect which builds on your talks on messages, not topics. You support messages with visual evidence, say like graphs, actual images, or something like an infographic, which utilizes like vector art. And this helps lead to a greater understanding in the terms or the aspect of the audience. And for the speaker or presenter, it allows them to project a more confident and knowledgeable background of what they're speaking of. And so assertion evidence is very key in terms of engineering presentations or design presentations, because you're trying to propose or say that your solution is going to be the best, and how do you go about doing that? Or you provide objective or empirical data to support the claim that you're making, and if whether or not you compare that to a theoretical value that you then earlier calculated, which again, essentially assertion evidence is the validation aspect or approach to effectively communicating, especially in presentations. What also makes you a competent communicator is being appropriate. Again, this goes back to the lack of appropriation for the first presidential debate. It conforms to expectations. Everyone has this precedence about how a certain event is supposed to be handled, how the speakers are supposed to be treating each other, or how the design layout of the floor and panel is, where people sit, even considerations such as color of the design or presentation space is to look. And so all of that is in consideration. Not so much now with Zoom, because we'd have to define out of that, or we use Zoom backgrounds or a Zoom room, which is a new and outbreaking business apparently. Communication is effective. We achieve goals, and it is meant to exchange information. And so without that, it's then ineffective. So being competent means we can exchange technically correct information without misinformation, so that we can lead to the correct solution. To be a competent communicator, we want to limit our vocal pauses. Vocal pauses can be so, like, or it's actual breaks in speech itself. And the reason why this is because mainly is that it's very distracting, especially for those who are aware of what how vocal pauses can do. It takes the attention away from the subject matter you're discussing. And so you want to limit that as much as possible. It's actually the hardest thing to do, aside from actually speaking on stage, if you have to do so. Stage fright is like the #1 fear or second fear in the nation, I believe. And of course, this can't all be done just by standing on stage and hoping you just have the motivation, knowledge, and skill to go about and be a great speaker. This takes practice. We have to have dry runs for presentations or for meetings. We need to go through a storyboard and effective planning, and to make sure that you can add extra takes if you're taking like a video or audio recording. And so it's very important to emphasize that practice can only help you in your delivery and presentation. And to move forward, I will now discuss the actual mechanisms in a presentation. Presentation mechanisms. One of them, as you just saw, which is a slide break or a section break, which is this right here. So I led into presentation mechanisms, and this can be such as a visual aid, like I said, like a graph or a picture or an image. There can also be hand gestures. This is a nonverbal mechanism, so hand gestures can be like pointing out, as you can see when you have like a finger out like that, or you can talk like this. Never want to say points at someone. There's just a symbolic message behind pointing. It declares an authoritarian connotation, which people can receive negatively. And in that sense, when that happens, it then distracts the audience from, or the person you're pointing at, from trying to listen in to what you're saying, and the information that exchanged is lost because of that interference. And another thing you want to use when you're performing on stage or in front of a crowd is if you're able to platform. And essentially, platforming is when you utilize the stage itself. A bad example of that, or what you couldn't use to platform, is like a presidential debate. But a good idea or a good representation of platforming can be seen in, say, like deliveries of product speeches or product showcases or launches. There's a lot of platforming there. Another example would be like TED Talks. The speakers often utilize the whole stage. So an example of platforming would be that if I had a stage split into 3 parts, which was the left half, the middle, and the right half. Let's say if I had walked out on stage from a side, walked to the center, I would then give my introduction or my attention getter to the audience. When I would do that, if I wanted to move into the body or the next bullet points in my speech, I would say take 2 steps to the left to utilize the left half of the stage. I am then now non-verbally signifying to the audience that I am moving to the next point by physically representing that movement to the left half of the stage. And say if I'm in transition, if I want to move into my 3rd bullet point, right, I would then walk from the left half of the stage to the right half of the stage, which could be like a supporting evidence to the topic or idea that I've introduced in the previous slide or for the previous points. And then when I want to transition to that, I physically represent that transition in platforming by walking from the left-hand side of the stage to the right-hand side of the stage. And when I arrive at the right-hand side of the stage, I would then go about and say, and as my next supporting point for that thing or for the next feature I would like to announce is X. So platforming is very powerful for mechanisms of nonverbal presentation, but etiquette should also be very much kept in mind. Etiquette is essentially ensuring that you don't have your hands crossed, don't have your legs crossed, never stand on your tippy toes, or you want to kind of stand on your tippy toes, never rest on your heels, never lock your knees. You want to stay fluid with your body. Stretching before a performance or before a presentation or speaker note is very important, because the last thing you want to do is cramp or not feel comfortable as much as possible while you're on stage. The idea is that you want to be on stage in your most comfortable mindset to go ahead and present. So etiquette, again, making sure you don't interrupt people, don't try to cut people off, don't try to overspeak on them or talk over them. Definitely allow them to finish. If there's a moment where you have to use a hand gesture to signify something, don't go rambunctious or overly abundant with your arm waving. That's again distracting or interference to the information you're projecting. And again, this translates into the visual aids that we use. And so graphs, which is such as like data visualization, can vary by style. And it can also be influenced by corporate identity. So we have vectors, which are logos, symbols, or icons. When you have a presentation aesthetics, you want to try to be as minimalist as possible, be color competent, consistent, and repetitive. This is just normal graphic design cues. For hand gestures, as I was implying, that's useful to emphasize talking points, but again, don't water it down by gesturing for every point. Limit the types of pause gestures you use. Don't use 50 of them when you can use 5 more effectively. Use pan, pauses, pans, pauses, and space. Use the gesture. Don't directly point to the audience, as I said earlier. And you want to platform as much as possible. It keeps the audience engaged, but overdoing it can also lead to distraction because you're making the audience go back and forth while they also have to, read and encode messages from your slides, which can be overly done and which, have a lot of information. But the slides, again, then are there to only encompass the talking points you're making. And so I'll then talk about the design cues for making a presentation more coherent and more informal or effective, so that when you deliver a presentation, you're not trying to elude or distract, and you're trying to get the message across. And so for design presentation, you have a format, an organization, a structure, and layout. And essentially, format is what you see right now, right? You see the 2 colored bar above the main header, which is then broken up by a gray space on the top. And you can see that everything is kept to a hard left. Nothing is centered. All the text weight and style have been consistent. The organization can be chronological. It can be what is important, or how a component is used or broken down, or which subsystem goes before the other in terms from the frame up or from the subsystems out. Layout is also very important, as I pointed earlier. Being consistent with keeping the text to the left or pictures to the right, or vice versa, as long as you're maintaining that throughout the presentation. And so the planning that's involved to help you with going about, you can use something like a storyboard. And so what a storyboard would look like was that you have a format or a legend kind of denoting what each text of, or what an action is associated with that text, or what's supposed to be done, or if you're labeling speakers. This can also be done in a visual form or platforming storyboard, where you actually have picture boxes that are then represented by 1, 2, 3 until the end, which would then have a composition or visual representation of what you would like to accomplish. But because we had a storyboard that revolved around a video that was very presentation intense, we just relied on a typical dialogue spreadsheet or script, so that when we used Zoom to record this, it was very straightforward, and we had a competent system that allowed the person who handled the presentation slides, the content, all that into a seamless platform, so that we can go and move forward. And to notify each other of how we did that, we incorporated a checklist. And so we delineated who did what, and what was handled between each, the stage of what the step entailed to relate to, its priority, and the due date, and if there's any supporting information, and as well as was it completed or not. Therefore, we could deliver and render the video without any delays. So this is an idea of a planning for a checklist to ensure you're following all the procedures that you need to encompass. And so the last thing we're going to be doing is discussing the 7 principles of graphic design. And this is some freebies. Basically, when you're designing a presentation, you want to balance the amount of visual aids or images that are provided, and they want to ensure to have an indexical relevance to what you're speaking of. A lot of the times when images are made, there's some lost translation and meaning, or why it's supposed to be there. and that could be done for or interpreted for multiple reasons. You want to leave corners open as much as possible in any design or presentation proposal, etc. Because when you crowd the corners, it tends to pull the readers or observers or audience's eyes away from the main topic or what you're trying to present into these areas that aren't even important, because you want to keep the eyes of the readers or audience into a central area to where their eye movement is limited to a defined area instead of being stretched across the entire presentation. Again, you want to focus by eliminating the amount of distractions that you have in your presentation. When utilizing a certain hierarchy, or when you're trying to incorporate asymmetry, you want to do that by balancing the composition between positive space and negative space. And by doing so, for example, here on this slide, you can see that everything is text heavy to the left, with a very small border or padding between the header and the main text from the left-hand border of the presentation. While on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a lot of white space, not very much used. And this allows the reader or audience to kind of engage on or focus on the content you're presenting, which is in the meat here. You can see it's very minimalist. I only have very few bullet points. And if there's any more bullet points, it would obviously distract. You want to limit the amount of words that you use in a bullet. So the minimum you can have is, say, like three words to a bullet, like balanced visual aids is an example, and incorporate symmetries too. Another one, you don't want to exceed more than 9 words to a single bullet point. This is because it would then stretch across the entire screen. It also overcrowds the space. Let's say if you have like 8 bullet points and they're all 9 words long, right? You have essentially an 8x9 matrix of information that an audience or reader has to interpret, which can be overwhelming. It can be difficult for the audience or listener to observe and listen to you at the same time. And so balancing that asymmetry with, as well as concord and contrast and consistency. And concord and contrast, to touch on that, is essentially the precedence between what is conformed and what rebels, or finding the closer you can get to the gray area or minimizing gray area is what you want to achieve in a concord and contrast. So you want to have, a decent number of bodies of text with a decent mix of slides in your presentation. You want to have a decent mix of just visual representations in your slides with no text in it. For example, like the previous slides, I only had one header with the traditional format, and I only brought in pictures to emphasize the point I was making. I use section breaks with different colors, and so that's a concord and contrast, essentially. Establishing hierarchy, and this is done through a distinguishing of the values of text, the size of the text, or even the weight of it. So for example, here on this slide, we have a principles of graphic design in a larger bold font, but it's also the same font, which is consistent. So the body text is actually in a gray, but it's in the same font. And this distinguishing in colors helps to establish that hierarchy and to delineate what is just a header and what is body text. This can also be done by having even smaller body text like you see in your textbooks. So for example, if you say you had a textbook page, you have heavy column body texts, and then on, say, like the borders or the margins, you have this broken up space to where you have figures, and then those figures have a bullet or bolded figure marker for like figure 1.1, which then has a smaller subset of text to describe, associated with that image, the context of that image. And that, again, is established hierarchy within exchanging information in a textbook. Another example of that would be when you have a section header to a subsection header to the body text. And then if you want to go between say, a book title to a project title, or even to names of people or places. You can italicize or bold. Essentially, hierarchy is utilizing line weights, size, and the style of fonts. And alignment is very key. As you can see here on this slide itself, we have everything ordered to the left-hand side, and pretty much throughout the presentation, everything was kind of aligned to the left, especially for text. And you can see between, when I flip the slides, between here, so you notice that planning and design presentation are kept at the same height in terms of XY coordinates on the presentation screen. And that's, again, to establish consistency, but also to establish an alignment to say, at this break between the blue and red border, two-tone color border, I have my header that will always be there, which will then either be accompanied by sub-body text, which is then broken down into a hierarchy of grayed out text that has a lower weight and a smaller size. And here images are to the right, where it keeps planning at the center point. And when I change it here, it doesn't break and it's maintained consistent. In graphic design, this is called a horizon line. So establishing a horizon line is very important because it then minimizes, again, the distractions, helps you, again, to effectively communicate just by a simple alignment of text slides or headers within texts and slides and presentations. And this can be done in the master template of the slide presentation itself. And this just, again, hammers in the consistency because I had this, this kind of format embedded into all my slides or all my workshops. And so I've been slowly kind of feeding what it means to effectively convey design through this kind of trademark, I suppose. And so consistency is really key because it brings repetition. Repetition is favored amongst your audience because it allows them to find the coincidence or the relevance between topics or between discussions or presentations or the information. And so moving forward, if my screen wants to move forward. So for those present, if you'd like to participate, we're going to have an exercise where we go ahead and critique certain design presentations. And before we get into it, I wanted to kind of briefly go into what it means to give and receive criticism. So the purpose of criticism is that it's meant to serve and move forward the activity or process or piece into a state that reaches its end goal. And to go about doing that, it is a very difficult collaborative activity. And it's also much more difficult when you have multidisciplinary teams because you have feedback from multiple aspects. But if you have a MEA intense project, EEs would not be able to say give as much feedback and vice versa. But if you say had a electromechanical system you're trying to get feedback for, receiving feedbacks from both disciplines are also much more beneficial because it helps to maintain, streamline and maintain coherency between these subsystems in order to effectively deliver criticism. And critique is essentially to serve the work and not the person who made the work. This statement is here to reassure that those, as we said earlier, that designers must be vulnerable and they have to expose themselves to criticism or be subject to it, is to not take it brutally, and if you do, there is a negative intent or connotation by those giving criticism. And so when receiving, though, in general, it should be focused or emphasized that it's meant and associated towards the work which you're contributing towards, because the team is seeking a single united goal, and by doing that, people will kind of appear to get under your skin, but it's all in good reprimentations. That's the right word. Or reasoning. And so critique is not a competition. It's actually is a collaborative effort. And what that is that we must critique the work, and it's not to essentially say that you're better than mine or I'm better than you. And it should be honest and empowering. And you should never be able to feel like you're getting torn apart or demoralized or belittled, because if it's a competition, then the critique is pointless because in essence nobody wins. So if you have, say, a team member who tends to be more of a devil's advocate, um, and gets really enamored with being a devil's advocate, it can be really detrimental to the team, because then we have this aspect of where we feel like we can't make any progress because all these negatives are being pointed out without any positives or constructive criticism to move forward to make the design more appealing to the person who is playing the role of devil's advocate. So again, criticism is there to learn and for you to grow. And as often as you can learn as much from giving a crit as you can get from getting one. And this is why it should be paid close attention to in terms of receiving crits for students or from students. And people, when they discuss ideas or evolutions and ideations, it's to benefit the work itself or the project that everyone is moving towards. So I want to just touch base on how to give effective criticism. And it's that you should be kind. Instead of nice, essentially a nice crit is telling someone their work is pretty good just to avoid hurting their feelings. A kind crit is telling someone their work is not where it needs to be, so they know it needs to be improved or refined. You should be kind and honest instead of nice and disingenuous. Also, make sure that your feedback is not derogatory, insulting, or dismissive of the person in front of you. Remember that giving a good crit has absolutely nothing to do with being mean. And so you want to generally avoid criticisms or critiques. I would do it like this, or you should try it like that, isn't exactly constructive or corrective, or it is corrective but not constructive. The work is not about how someone else would do it, it's about how you would do it. The main problem with corrective crits is they often lead to a direct duplication of that comment, and that's not the point of a critique. While there is a bit more relevance in corrective critique for entry-level students who are learning the fundamentals of their profession, it should be done sparingly. The catch is that it is very, very easy for students to develop a habit of relying on crits to tell them exactly what to do next, rather than developing their own exploratory progress or process. And so a lot of art and design education is about trying stuff until you figure out what works. Being prescribed the exact right answer does not let this happen, which is a corrective statement. And so when giving criticism, if you're unsure of what to tell someone who is asking you for feedback, a good place to start is simply by describing what you see or what's in front of you or presented. Telling the creator of the work that you're trying to, or what you're seeing can be very useful. For example, for in-progress work, it is often different from what they tend to show. Telling them what you think they're trying to say will help them understand what the work is actually saying. Another good place to start is by telling the person receiving the crit how the work makes you feel. When you look at the work, do you feel excited, confused, bored, angry, calm? Regardless of whether the piece is art or design, your emotional response is just as valid because, again, as designers, we appeal to the emotional empathy of people and designers alike, which can provide valid feedback, or lead to it at least, and can help the creator of the work create something much more meaningful or purposeful. And so that's just a little smidge or take from or giving criticism, and that's from a website that I will link also in the channel. And so to move forward into the presentations that we're going to be taking a look into, if my slides could move forward. So here we have the 2 slide presentations that we're going to be observing. And we're just going to go ahead and go through it and kind of write down what you would think would be some differences, some similarities, likes, dislikes, essentially anything that can be compared, essentially in regard to slide layout, composition, repetition, and language, not necessarily the content itself. We're just going to look at how the presentations are physically represented visually. And whether or not these presentations obey the rules we've just previously discussed. And so what we want to do is give a constructive criticism to these presentations as to what you liked, disliked, what could be better, what's lacking, etc. So without further ado, so here is the design review 2 for Viking Motorsports. Personally, I believe this was, in terms of slide coherence and format, I believe this was kind of one of the better ones. And as we can see on this first slide, there's a lot of information. There's a icon and a QR code in the corners. And that's because this was to emphasize the fact of the FSE vehicle in front. But as a design practice, we should look forward to moving the logos into either being smaller on the bottom or, maintaining or constraining the size concord and contrast between the logos, especially for PSU and Viking Motorsports, and possibly moving all of the logos to the bottom. So having Portland State slide over to the left of the, and just by the credits, have the Viking Motorsports logo move over, and then maybe move the QR code, or if you can say rather that you like this format and it works because the QR code takes significance, then this presentation and layout works because you want people to check into the meeting, which provides a function. And so you could argue that this layout is actually fine because although it does not obey the rules we previously discussed, which is not keeping the corners open, it does activate the edges. There's some alignment, which is along the borders or the top and bottoms of the pages. And there is some compositional balance between the main space and negative space. And so we understand that we're going to be presented a presentation from Viking Motorsports. That's just, again, a critique of the, or evaluation of the title slide. People are going to evaluate differently. We're going to fast forward and you can see the layout kind of start to show. We have the overview kind of staying at the same height and level and hierarchy. We have established that horizon line, which is kind of this line here that we established. So if we move forward to the slides, they stay consistent. We can see the bullet points all stay aligned to the left-hand side, which is really nice. Again, provides coherence. Personally, I would emphasize the fact that if these bullet points could start at the edge of this letter to kind of give us this entire space here as a border to use, which would be really nice if these bullet points could be over here. But again, it creates the asymmetry and alignment factor that we want because it's a very text rich slide, quote unquote. There's not a lot of visuals being utilized, so we don't have a lot of activation of edges. The 3 page number takes up the corner, which is all right because it provides information. So we'll kind of neglect the keep the corners open rule. Here for subsystem leads, you can see that we have the main bullet again, kind of remaining consistent. And there's repetition here. And then we have this slide which breaks up the text heavy slides that were previous with a graphic slide to kind of give readers a, like a break from the text intense slides that were presented. And here is, again, another slide, but now we've introduced another system within these slides. So we now have a bolded headline here with the bullet points, but as you can see here, the bullet points fall or nest nicely within the alignment of the previous sentence. And what this does, it provides a nice clean border. And again, my only critique here would be if we could move it to the right to have all of this line up with the V here to give us this nice border, to give us a concord of contrast of space to build that asymmetry so that we can be innately more appealing to a reader or audience. And so again, that system is maintained. We have the bold here, moving forward into the bold. But you can see there's no sign, so no size change, but now we have added these bullets. And so I would argue that this would be an inconsistency or something we'd have to fix if we wanted to maintain physical appearance or visual coherence. But here is a nice looking border that we've established, and as well as the space that's broken up by these dots. In graphic design, this is what you would call tension, which is the space that kind of tenses between two elements within a presentation. So we have text and we have a visual aid or bullet. And so here we have tension and tension with this border, which is to draw the eye of the reader to these points. And then we have a hierarchy established between objectives, what is our objectives, and then we have the descriptions of the objectives broken down into a sentence that has a smaller weight or smaller size and lower weight. And now we move back into the system of kind of presenting information, which is fine. And we've now introduced another set of bullets. And so here goes the nitty gritty. The overview, real nice, kind of kept succinct. You can see here that the frame or the goals and the system changes here. But in fact, because we introduced this system early on, right here, so that system of where we didn't have a bullet for this header, but bullets here, we've then brought that system here. So this is when if you introduce the system, at least be consistent and maintain it. So what we've done here, we've reintroduced that system, which is a great feat for in terms of conveying information, being remaining that relevance between the slides and building that relationship that we want to achieve in communication. This tells people that it doesn't distract from people's observations and mental processing. So nice job there. And again, we're now introducing another system where we have a component that we've highlighted here, which has remained consistent at that height or the horizon line. We now have visuals on the right-hand side and on the left-hand side. And so it's a good mix of visuals bouncing between left and right. I would argue that it shouldn't bounce one side after the next. Maybe if this was, if all these slides for the pedal box remained on the right-hand side, like this is visual platforming, I suppose. For a pedal box, we had kept all of these to the right. And if we say move to the steering wheel, then we keep it all to the right as well, bouncing. And as we notice here, the steering wheel didn't bounce between left-hand or right-hand side of images. It stayed on the right-hand side. So this part looks really well. And again, these bullet points are no more than like 9 sentences or 9 words rather. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, just underneath the cusp there. It gets the main points across. This is only to subsidize what you're actually saying in the presentation. So I'd argue these steering wheel present slides are really well done. What is suspension? It connects the tires to the frame. And there's this kind of brake here, which is nice. This is just, I guess, the system we're going to be using. So if we've established it and we're using it all the time, that's fine that we kind of have this break in or disobeying the rules of graphic design and how we present information. So if we're going to break it, as long as we're consistent in breaking it, we're good in presenting information. Therefore, the reader has some sort of repetition or profile that's being developed to understand the change in conveying that information or format of it. And here we have this nice break to a single sentence, which I actually like this because it puts it right in front of you, right? We want to emphasize this. We have established a hierarchy. This is our important thing here. And what we really want you to know in terms of suspension is that we are here to maximize cornering speed, etc. And so having this statement on its own is a great way to, without a visual aid, to get people to read and just take in this bit of information. And it's not overwhelming. It's very minimalist. There's a change. There's a italicized text here, which is great because it distinguishes it from the normal body text, which is not italicized. So I think this is a great tactic here. And for suspension to utilize this kind of method. And then here we're now choosing colors because suspension wants to delineate subdivisions. So using colors and then finding that mapping here, so which is a great tool. We've generated a legend here. I would argue this slide here was greatly done in formatting because I completely understand what's been going on. The only contingency or critique I have for this would be the overlap of text here. It's great that it's above it. However, it does become distracting. But I also understand that kinematics modeling and suspension mechanism is very long-winded, but it only has 5 words. So otherwise, it's very well done. And here now we've reintroduced that system again. That was shown in frame, which was having bulleted bold subheaders with the body text accompanied in a smaller font or a smaller size and lower weight. Break capstone, you can see that. So one thing here that I've noticed is that there is a shift in bullets. So we have bullets here hitting a hard left against the screen, causing good tension, which is what we want. We have this part aligning really well with break capstone. This was done this is probably done by someone else. Really great organizing here. But then you can see that system is quickly demolished by going back to the system it was previously founded. So that, again, can be distracting for audiences. We want to try and reflect on making sure that we ensure all of our paragraphs and body texts don't have that break or change in or shift, rather. So again, very important to kind of refine that if you're proofreading before a presentation. Yeah, so in terms of how it looks, layout, this is a nice break in information. Here we were very text heavy, and we went straight into very visual heavy. Again, there's legends everywhere. We have understanding, but we have the kind of coefficients broken down here, which we can then find here, for all the plots that they've done for tire data and lateral forces and longitudinal forces. So so one stipulation I would argue in terms of critique would be the change here and shifting up and down between headers. So we have this shift here. This is what breaks your horizon line. So in terms of making sure we're coherent, I would argue that this horizon line has now been broken because of this shift in the header. But then again, I also understand that this is a very text-heavy or visual-heavy slide. So to make room for that or to make it look appealing in terms of presentations, not to be overwhelming, this has to be kind of moved up here. Or the slides could be, or these graphs could be smaller, and they could be organized or structured into a linear fashion or a cube. So you have all four images here. I would argue that this change in text between, light gray or, gray text for body to black text is somewhat distracting too. So next time, I think ensuring that that's at this kind of color and size would help to maintain that design presentation coherency. And I hope along the way everyone's noticing that the critiques I'm giving is served purposely towards the work. I don't know who made it. I do care, but at the same time, when I'm giving back criticism, I want to focus on the aspect itself. And if I'm focusing on just the 7 principles of graphic design, which is what we're all supposed to be doing, I'm just going about assessing the graphic design impact and design cues of this presentation. You can see here that there's a nice progression. There's no break in text too much. All the sizes are generally the same. So great job here maintaining consistency between slides. Great job there. This is a great way to break up kinematics to kind of explain a bunch of the angles that are attributed to handling suspension, travel, and tire contact. So great way to break up the text with visuals. And then moving back into visuals here, or text here. And yeah, it seems it appears everyone's kind of coherent in terms of size and hierarchy, so it looks good. Yep, that ARB part and track and drag simulations look great. And so here, one thing I would like to point out through the entire presentation, we had an overview for each kind of subsystem. And to go back to hammer it in, we go back to the overview of suspension. This was their overview, and they just called it what is suspension. And frame also had an overview, and it just had this. But they all didn't utilize the same, template, whereas chassis chose to have their goal in the overview, whereas suspension wanted to have the goal broken up from the overview of suspension. And so that's a noticeable difference. But again, I think it makes it unique to the subsystem itself. But overall, in terms of design presentation, it can be distracting or lead to kind of incoherencies and graphic design precedents. Regardless, let's go back to this presentation. Here we have the same system that was introduced into suspension. So again, like I said, if we're going to introduce something and if we're going to use it again, maintain the same kind of complacency. Here we have blue, green, and orange, just like it was in suspension. And as an extra tidbit, I want to say that the colors are even organized in the same fashion, which they are. So we have red, green, and orange, or rather blue, green, and orange. And then if we go back to the accumulator, the color order is also maintained, which was a nice touch. We also have the same visual. The only thing I would argue is the distinct difference between them is the placement of the visual itself, as they're not in the same place. So this image of the Auburn car is actually, offset to the bottom and more to the right on suspension, whereas in electronics it's more to the left. Anyways, that's just a minor critique, but that's not even that important in terms of the overall coherency here. But if it's in terms of the nitty gritty of, or not etiquette, but the kind of consistency of it all, it does play into the distracting parallelogram of the audience. So we have the timeline introduced here. Great. We have the, again, you can see the shift in these. We have the shift in borders or alignment. So here there's a shift in alignment on the left-hand side. There's actually 3 shifts. Oh no, just 2. Yeah. But at least the hierarchy is established. At least there's a strong, nice border here. again, everything I said before. Here they did use some arrows to help associate their sketches to make sure that information is properly conveyed. Very, again, limited to 2 words or less. Here's a nice break of a picture or highly, visual intent slide. Here you can see there's actually a mix-up with cooling slots. That was something that was probably missed during the refinement period. The system kind of remains here. Still kind of present here, but again, there's a shift in what's to the left and what's hard left or tensioned and what's kind of aligned ambiguously. Again, that was probably a lack of refinement that was needed there. Again, another shift in where the border begins for the headers and the body of the text. At least there's a strong hierarchy. Again, you can see when there's high number of rows in a single slide, especially if you were to go, say, like 9 words long here. So here we only have like 5 words, but if we were to go like 8 or 9, and this was to continue over and over, you can see how intense this slide would have been with all the text. And there's a nice balance here of asymmetry with a lot of white here and a lot of gray, but they're nearly even. But that's unavoidable with the amount of information trying to be conveyed for this slide. And I would probably argue there's probably too much words on the slide, but they need to get across, or at least explicitly stated here. Again, too much words can lead to confusion or consumption of mental bandwidth that the listener or audience has to withstand for the present information or exchanging. So this amount of words might be a little overkill. The borders are right. There's the system of pictures on the right and bullets on the left. So that's maintained nicely throughout electronics. Yeah, so there's always a consistent frame, picture, or image on the right, and text on the left, which was nice. There's not a lot of jumping left and right, as opposed to the pedal box that I mentioned earlier. Again, the platforming shown in the pedal box where it goes from left to right of visuals is perfectly fine. Just not just not in the sequential order. If it's like alternating, might be fine for between assemblies or components. And that's all for design review 2. And again, those are all just brief criticisms I was going out aloud about. Trying to hammer in the point of what it means to give criticism. And so we're actually going to go here to a capstone presentation for the winter status update. If you're in the ME department, you'll be giving a status presentation update for your project or capstone, which will entail a brief summation of all the progress you've done up to that point during winter term, or even through fall term, because presentations, I believe, start in like the 3rd or 4th week of winter term. So without further ado, you can see here that there's a strong left-hand border here. There's a hierarchy established between title, subtitle, and then subtext here with different colors and body weights and sizes or font sizes. There's actually slide transitions, which I would argue isn't very appealing in terms of it's a very distracting manner or method to transition between slides. And it kind of, again, just distracts the reader or audience and the information you're trying to present because of that transition. But here, at least, we can see that there's a break in slides. So here we have a gray background with a white bar. Nice breakup of space there in the background. And here we have a left-hand side, we're at a grayed out background as opposed to a white background here. Nice breakup of space. And this is a nice slide to present team members or roles. Again, hierarchy established here with bold text accompanied by the same size, but just not the same weight of text. The team name, and the team members, kind of indexically relevant kind of slide. and nicely broken up. Again, borders are followed. We maintained rules. There's alignment here. Good breakup of space. There's composition, you know, a lot of negative space here, but a lot of space filled up, just spread out. So that's also a tactic that can be used. And here you can see that the kind of the same title, or not title, but the slide background is maintained, and that's to break up the space again. And that horizon line is established here, even though we changed between the format of the slide. So this background will look completely different. Instead of this gray half and this right half, that is asymmetrical. We're going to have a asymmetrical white half here and a grayed out top here. Because of the fact of the information presented, this nearly violates the number of words allowed for a bullet. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, so these bullet points already violate the 7 or the 9 word maximum for a bullet. So again, this should be probably shortened, or it kind of truncated at least, to where the speaker has to present more, and then as opposed to what's being actually presented on the presentation or the slides. Therefore, this slide can be more visually appealing and less distracting, or less computatively consuming for the mental bandwidth of the audience. Here we've established a very decent horizon line you can see between all the slides. Even when I transition through the different slide backgrounds, the headers remain at the same height or X and Y position. And here we have another breakup change in space that's being reflected. And this is, again, somewhat of like a platforming technique, but I guess it's useful here. It works here because of the change in sections and how you go about presenting these ideas. Whereas opposed, it was very distracting here because you have things pop up one at a time, which isn't very straightforward, or takes up more time, and information that's being processed is being taken up by the car that's there, and then slowly the brain has to adjust to what the presenter is presenting at a time that they choose, and not allowing the reader to just take it in as they please, or read the information as they please, instead of it being spoon-fed to them when they're having these kind of delayed transitions. And so this slide maintains that coherency between images. Everything kind of follows the same border. Here you have an actually example of text and visuals. And here I believe these borders are activated. So this is a great way to kind of leverage the borders and to also get a bunch of information across. And I believe this slide was projected to take up like 2 to 3 minutes. Therefore, the audience could receive and decode everything presented in a timely manner while also listening to us, maintaining a 2 to 3 minute pace for this slide. And you can see here that there's a change in the entire slide itself. You don't have the system with the 2-colored bar here. The background at the top is gone. For this slide, there's actually a change in header size, which is distracting because it zooms in and out. But aside from that, the remainder of the slides kind of maintain that alignment, negative space, it's asymmetrical. There's a breakup in left to right. As you can see here, I guess the images don't necessarily go left to right, but they kind of circulate. So they start on the bottom, move up, and then move to the right, and then back to the left. I would argue this is okay. However, again, it is distracting. Maybe flip the text and the images here. Have the text on the left, images on the right, so it doesn't flop like how it did from this slide. So again, image on the right, and then it shifts to the left. It's distracting, so maybe we should flip these in order to make it more coherent visually. Here we've introduced another system to compare between thermal pastes. This was a breakdown of the system, or at least a theoretical breakdown of the circuit for the thermal resistance and the results from it. But as you can see, the horizontal line or horizon line that is maintained stays consistent. There's no change there. You know that it's still talking about contact resistance because it doesn't change. Your brain doesn't have to exercise more computational bandwidth to understand that there's going to be something different, because it doesn't. There's a consistency here. I would argue that this picture could be blown up a bit more. It is very small. I can barely see these numbers here, especially if you're presenting to a bigger audience. You want to utilize more screen space. Here you can see the text is very large, so I feel like people wouldn't get distracted or lost in what's being conveyed because the sizing is appropriate. There's a mapping here or delineation of what it means between the comparisons here. We have thermal paste, which is shown here. Maybe it should be a little more obvious. Here we have direct contact, but we've denoted a legend in system. Moving forward. Yeah, here, this is really distracting. Definitely go ahead and proofread your slides. Again, if you have a breakup and border like this, people will obviously see that. It will distract them from what's being, the meat of the data, which is here. And, at least everything's bolded here, bolded there. So, we're, comparing materials and components, which are all bolded. We even have a breakup in temperature between cold and hot. So we semantically said it's cold, and then we added the context of it, which should be in blue, which is the indexical reference of being cold. Typically when it's hot, we think of red, because when things get red, they're glowing red, almost white. So that's a delineated system or mapping for people to understand the information presented or exchanged. So one system that I will say is at least consistent if it's being done is that because of the transitions when they fade, even though they are distracting, I would argue that at least it is coherent and consistent because it's done every time there's a change in the background. So again, we have this kind of gray area here broken up by this larger white area here, which only happens when that format is being transitioned to. So I guess that's what the platform reference is, which again can be found in this slide. So there's a change there. But again, this isn't talk about the next subject matter. Right, so this was the system we introduced. And so that system is then lost here. So the argument then again, even though it is coherent, or I guess this kind of associates the next bullet point. So the system actually does in fact work, because I believe methodology and progress are two separate bullets. And that it then goes to the same thing for outlook, which is another bullet, or the future kind of anticipations for the project and timeline. Same system that's been managed throughout the presentation is still here, so that's a good sign. Again, everything's aligned very nicely. That horizon line is still relevant. I would argue that this and this not being on the same boundary, or invisible line that would run across this, the bottom of this this header all the way over. Anything these bits, if it's going to be coherent and consistent, should at least follow the alignment principle. So the bottom of this text should align with the bottom of this text for easier learning and observing by your reader or audience or listeners. So here we have a change in spring 2020, which is seen in the transition The transition again helps to emphasize what's being changed and added. So I guess it's a good system for going between the main bullet points. So in the sense, I would argue that although transitions that have a fade in or fade out are distracting, but in a typical presentation, but if used consistently and within a system of hierarchy that is, that defines it early and maintains it, is then in fact useful because it's being carried out throughout the entire presentation. Yeah, so a lot of things we learned there, things we could do better with or improve upon. That's again to serve the work itself. I just wanted to show that and highlight that here today. I was hoping to get more or people have feedback. Yanni, do you have any feedback at all? Or things you want to talk about or discuss? Or if not, it's totally fine. Or, all right, well, Yanni, if you have anything, that'll be the end of this workshop. Thank you for everyone who's been watching and tuning in. Design Workshop 4, or the Relationships of Dynamic Systems, will be held next Sunday. And I believe that is the 30th, or the 1st rather. So November 1st is the next workshop. So see you all there. Thank you for tuning in again, and have a great rest of your week.